First of all, thank you for coming. A few months ago, I got a call from, as I do many times, hello, synagogue, Chabad, rabbi, and this time it was from somebody who was now going to be a very good friend. Otto has moved in recently to be here with his extended family, and it's been wonderful to have you in shul and to join the community. And then I learned that Otto has a unique story, being a Holocaust survivor, and I was bent on having Otto speak, and we are very glad that we were able to do this. Otto speaks in, as you may know, in many places, and including local public schools, and he'll give you some of the details maybe. But here we have you here as one of us in the shul, and we're very honored, highly honored. Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is the day when we do this Jewishly. It's the liturgy that we have in the morning, that we read this morning, quite at length in the synagogue, is pieces of liturgy that speak of Jewish suffering throughout the ages. It is the day that the first temple was destroyed in Jerusalem 500 years later, roughly on the very same date. The second temple was destroyed, each bringing with itself the long Jewish exile and saga, which we were witness to in various times, in various ages. And obviously in our time, we could say, historically this is yesterday. And although most of us did not witness it, maybe we were alive to know of it during when it happened, but most of us looking around, we were not. And that is all the more reason to come together and to make sure that the events of the Holocaust, the events and the reasons, the causes are never to be repeated, and to always remain in our collective memory, in our not just memory, but as Jewish people, we live these things. It's not the word zachor, to remember, is not just to remember. When it comes to Shabbos, we declare it, we live it, we do it as a people. Personally, actually, the day of Tisha B'Av in my own family is also a unique day, because although my immediate family, my grandfather on my mother's side was in Israel, wasn't yet the state of Israel, it was but pre-state in Israel at the time of the war. My other grandfather fought the Japanese for 6 years in Burma in the Royal Air Force. That's what he did during the war. But the closest relative that we as a family lost in the Holocaust was a young boy, a great uncle of mine, who went to learn in yeshiva in Europe, in Tels. Tels is in Lithuania. And the Nazis had the custom of keeping a Jewish calendar, and it's known that they made raids on Jewish days. Two survivors of that yeshiva, the Tels Yeshiva relocated actually in Baltimore, in Maryland. It's there alive and well till today. But the Tels Yeshiva that was in Tels in Lithuania were all taken out on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, specifically, purposely, and all shot on that day. And there were two survivors who came, and therefore my family, personally, we keep Yortzeit on Tisha B'Av. We happen to know that day when it happened. So personally, in our family, that's the day that we do it. Jewishly, we sometimes do things one way, but sometimes another way. I'd like to, just for a minute, before we have Otto come and give the presentation, but just for a minute we never tell a story in Judaism without saying and giving the moral of the story. We have a story here now, a life story of somebody we're going to hear, of who we know and who we have to be adamant on continuing to our children, whether biological or the next generation. But we have to continue that story with a certain lesson, with a certain why. When we speak of the story of the Exodus of Egypt, there's a reason why we choose to live this story. What are the lessons of this story, and how therefore should we lead our lives because of this story? And there's obviously much been written, much been told about the morals and lessons of a story which we humanly can't really wrap our heads around. It numbs a human being when we try to even fathom it. But nevertheless, we have an obligation. And that obligation has to be fulfilled, and therefore we have to take a step back and learn the lesson of that story. And specifically, the lesson, one of the great lessons, Otto has a book here, which is for sale. You'll see at the back. He will be signing books also. Thank you for giving us a copy. I read it cover to cover. And Otto lived through there's a unique angle in his story, because he saw what the commoner, the regular citizen, the usual guy, the guy off the street, was capable of perpetrating. These were not trained murderers necessarily. These were not, intensely brainwashed by the Nazi narrative or whatever it was. These were people who were neighbors, who were people that were down the street. And in many parts of the book and in the presentation, you'll pick up on that. And the lesson, therefore, is to never ignore that area, that element of the human condition, that we as human beings, as the Talmud tells us, we are created at the end of the creation, in the creation narrative in Genesis. We are right at the end, and the reason for that is because the human being is capable of being the hilt, the climax of creation. The human being is also capable of being the last, the lowest of all creation, and the choice is ours of which one to choose. And therefore, the education, the knowledge, not just of the story, but of what enabled such a story to happen, is so crucial in the memory of this whole thing. Specifically, that a new generation, a generation that will not necessarily live to see the people who went through this, a new generation, younger generation, must have it engraved in their hearts that there is a moral compass, there is a moral code, there are prohibitions and there are obligations that stand entirely beyond what they like to feel, what they think, or anything that goes on in them. There is a being above them, there is an instruction, there is a code which tells us how to live, by which we are obligated, and nothing can justify. Nothing can tell us that these things are, can be abrogated for one reason or another. We insist as Jews, there is an obligation that Jewish people have. We've mentioned this over here many times. There's an obligation that we Jews have to teach the world, teach people who are not necessarily of the Jewish persuasion, the way of life, the code known as the 7 laws of Noah, the code by which the world should live. And that code, the Talmud tells us, must be taught in a way that this is the instruction of the Torah. These laws and ethics, many of them are in the 10 Commandments. Don't kill, don't steal, etc. But these ethics must be taught in a way that they stem from a being, they stem from the Torah, they stem from God, which by virtue of that are non-negotiable. Once, if they do not emanate from a super being, from a being that is higher than me and you and anybody else who says anything in this world, if it does not emanate from God, then it is negotiable ultimately. And if you have the right conditions, then these things can be perpetrated. These prohibitions can be overlooked or even purposely transgressed. That is the moral in one sense, in one way. And again, but nevertheless, we must always hear the story, know the story, and in that way, I invite Otto to come up, and truly an honor to have you.
Thank you. Hi. First of all, I was born in Sudetenland, which which is the part of Czechoslovakia that was adjoining Germany. And I was actually where I was born was quite close, in 1934. And prior to my birth, actually my parents were wondering what was going on in Germany nearby. Already anti-Semitism was hard and fast, and so they were thinking about leaving. But lo and behold, my mother became pregnant and with me, and so they decided they had to stay, of course, and they couldn't travel with a newborn. So I was born in July of 1934, and we lived there for several years. My father had a very nice job as a traveling salesman for a textile manufacturer, and my mother actually enjoyed her life very much. Also, I have pictures of her skiing on the nearby Sudetenland, and they went to dance. They tried to lead a normal life, but at the same time, they were very nervous what was going on in Germany. Actually, Hitler became the Führer, the leader of Germany, about 8 or 9 days after I was born. And so there were a lot of things that were filtering back to Sudetenland, where, first of all, the burning of synagogues, a number of synagogues were burned. Also, Dachau was the first concentration camp. It was up and running already, I think in 1932 already. So my parents stayed put, and then came 1938. In 1938, they decided they would have to leave, that we would have to find a way of getting out of there. And March came along, March of 1938, and Austria was annexed to Germany. And by this point, by the way, in the Jews living in Germany, they lost their citizenship. Their passports had to have the letter J for Jude stamped on it, and any Jew that did not have a Jewish kind of a first name would have to have a Jewish middle name. So the men had to have the name of Israel, and the women had to have the name of Sarah. So in March, when Austria was annexed, there were about 200,000 Jews living in Austria. And it became a terrible thing for them because, first of all, they lost their citizenship also when it was annexed to Germany. And a lot of them tried to leave, and it was very difficult. My parents tried to get to Madagascar and Brazil and Argentina and also in Canada, and it did not work out. So this was in March, and then in June of 1938, President Roosevelt called a meeting of various nations around the world to open up quotas, to increase their quotas for Jews who wanted to desperately escape from Europe. So there was this meeting at Evian, France, 22 nations, and the only nation that increased the quota. United States increased it somewhat, but the other one was Dominican Republic. And Evian, if you spell it backward, is naive. And the cynic would say this was the naive conference, not the Evian conference. And my parents heard about it, that nothing was going on and they couldn't do it, so we stayed put. So this was in the summer of 1938. And mind you, in Sudetenland, there were 3 million German-speaking Czechs living. So there was quite a bit of anti-Semitism where we were living. And they were very sympathetic and responsive to what Hitler was saying. And in fact, there were some votes, and I think it was 97% saying that Sudetenland should be annexed to Germany. And my parents, of course, were very apprehensive because we would lose our citizenship. And sure enough, September 30th, 1938, there was the Munich Agreement that annexed Sudetenland. So automatically we lost our citizenship. And I want to say a little aside, years later, after the war, we would consistently talk about what happened to us. And I remember telling my parents, I tried to make it light. I want to make it light. I didn't want to be treated as a victim, but as a survivor. And I wanted all of us to be survivors. And so my parents, they lost their citizenship. And I lost my citizenship, so I would joke with my parents. I would say, you know, the three of us have become canceled checks. So, and it would get a laugh, but we would continue. We would consistently talk about what had happened to us. I mean, mind you, I lost 53 members of our family during the war. Grandfathers, grandmothers, aunts, uncles. I lost a cousin who had polio, and she could hardly walk, and she was murdered immediately in Auschwitz. It was terrible. So 1938, when the papers were signed, my parents decided to abandon the house, which was all paid up, and just escape. And we did. We escaped to Prague, which was not far. It was only about 60 miles away, and we escaped to Prague, and my parents figured that in Prague maybe they would be able to get a immigration permit to some country that we could get to. A lot of people were doing that. So we were in Prague, and my parents told me they had no money because my dad tried to go to the bank in Teplitz right after the agreement was signed, the Munich agreement was signed, to withdraw his savings. He had some savings. And the bank was closed. So he figured in Prague he would go to the branch and he would get the money from them. So in Prague, he went to the bank, to the branch, and they said the only way you can get it is if you go back to Sudetenland. You can withdraw it personally because that's where you banked. So he couldn't. So what they did, my mother sold. She had an engagement ring. She sold that, and we lived on whatever they could scrape together. And then there came a point in 1939 already. First, the Nazis invaded Prague in March of 1939. And my parents felt that there was going to be a war that was imminent. And they decided they wanted to give me away